We are joined now by the first guest of the day, and I've been told that her husband has spectacular taste in radio. I am a monster fan. We're talking Kim Strassel. She's got a new book, The Biden Malaise, How America Bounces Back from Joe Biden's Dismal Repeat of the Jimmy Carter Years. You are a, Kim, columnist and editorial board member of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm going to fangirl out here a little bit. I absolutely love the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. I've said this on the show before, Kim. I think the two most trusting and important pages that are produced in American media every day are your editorials and then all the op-eds that you guys run. I always thought that. But the willingness that you all had to put out truthful analysis during COVID was so, I felt a lot of times like I was walking in a desert and every now and then would just get to drink from an actual oasis because it was so rare. So thanks for all that you guys have done. Tell us about the book.
Well, first of all, let me fanboy back to you. I am a huge fan, and as I mentioned as well, every day my husband walks into my office and said, "You want to know what Clay and Buck just said?" So he is a fan, never
That's
misses
awesome.
it. Um, so the book is essentially a comparison of the Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden years, and it goes through the kind of eerie similarities between those two administrations, separated by 44 years. And there's a lot, right? Inflation, high energy prices, foreign policy debacles, problems at the border, high crime. The list goes on. But the central premise of the book is that that comparison is fundamentally unfair to Jimmy Carter.
Now tell us why.
Yeah.
So in what way? Because people have been making that comparison for years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, okay. So here's why it's unfair. I think it's both a question of what they inherited and also intent. So Jimmy Carter was dealt a much tougher hand. All right. We already had the great inflation raging around the globe. We'd had a world oil shock. We had the Cold War. He inherited high crime rates. This is in stark contrast to Joe Biden, who was dealt a pretty awesome hand. He had an economy that was just about to round the corner and come blasting out of COVID. We had just a couple of years prior to his taking office become a net exporter of fossil fuels. Crime was not necessarily an issue at that time. The border certainly doesn't look anything like it does now. And so my argument being is that he took a good situation and managed to destroy it, essentially. But the other argument is that is intent, in that Jimmy Carter, the rap on him, he inherited a bad situation, but he was well-meaning, he was just incompetent, and he was engulfed by a series of crises. Fundamentally, this was not a guy, though, who wanted bad things to happen to the country or who wanted to turn us into a European-style social welfare state. That's in contrast, I think, to Joe Biden, who's been very deliberate in these policies, in the spending for new entitlement programs, in his climate agenda, which is really squelching our domestic industry. And these are all being done for ideological goals, even though they're causing real economic harm.
Hey, Kim, it's Buck. Thanks for being with us. The book that Kim Strassel has is The Biden Malaise, which is just out. Everyone should check it out. Kim, something we talk about often here is, are the Democrats all in when push comes to shove? Are they all in on Biden 2.0 at 80-something years of age? Or do you think, you've written a book on this, you've looked deep into all things Biden, do you think that there's either a threshold that they could pass in the next 6 months, or have they already passed it where they really are scrambling to come up with some kind of a plan B?
50-50. I think there's a 50-50 chance somebody gets in still to challenge them. Look, one thing I've always given Democrats, they have a lot more discipline than Republicans do. They're far more unified. That's a good thing and a bad thing in my mind. Better for them on politics, probably not better for the country in terms of policy. But, they have decided that they're going to stick with their horse. They're not going to abandon them. But it's very difficult. I do not see how you could be a Democrat looking at the wrecking ball that is becoming the White House and this president and his performance and not be very, very nervous. And I think that's why you say, I mean, look, Gavin Newsom essentially is a presidential candidate in waiting. He's all but out there on a campaign. He's just waiting. I think it's going to, if we have some sort of crisis in the White House, if he has some sort of health scare, if there's some moment of like really bad, a bad call that really reflects badly and the polls go even lower, that might be the moment.
Kim, I said that I super trust everything that you guys do at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm curious how you would assess other coverage that you see. And Buck and I talk a lot about one of the biggest, and this goes for our show too, but certainly any media entity, one of the biggest decisions, maybe the biggest decision, is what do you cover? And then when you cover something, how do you feature it? How do you help distribute it so that people become aware of it? We were talking earlier in the show about the IRS whistleblowers and their report. I actually looked because I'm old man still. I like to get the newspaper. I believe the New York Times buried it bottom of page 16. One reason I like the physical newspaper is it allows you to see editorial judgment. I think the Wall Street Journal had it on page 4 or page 5. Do you think when you see the way that the New York Times and the Washington Post, I used to read those newspapers all the time. I went to school in D.C. They were left-leaning, but there wasn't a willful blindness in the way that they covered things. It doesn't seem to me 20 years ago. Is that a business imperative? Is it an editorial imperative? What do you think has happened to those two newspapers? I think that the Wall Street Journal has not fallen victim to. I'm just curious with you as an inside view how you would assess it.
I would assess it as an abdication of editorial leadership. Look, if you look around at the media, and I've been in this industry a long time, you guys have, there's always been a left-leaning stance. Journalism tends to attract left-leaning, save the world, do-gooder types. They often come out of the same environments, the same universities. But we always relied on an older generation of editors to kind of knock that out of them and preserve the tradition of newspapers trying to come across as nonpartisan and trying to cover the news fair and equally and put the right emphasis on the right topics. Those editors have either left or they have been cowed by an increasingly progressive liberal staff that have come in. This was aided by Donald Trump's election because they essentially told themselves, hey, we are now morally entitled to get to be biased because we're doing good for the country by trying to stop a supposed budding authoritarian. They told themselves this, and it's now become mantra in these newspapers. They really, truly believe that they are practicing journalism instead of just pure advocacy, which is what's happening now.
Kim, you think that there's any chance at all that, going forward here, we're seeing multiple federal criminal trials, or at least, one federal already and soon to be announced, probably another one, a New York City criminal trial, all these things against Trump. Is there any chance in your mind that some of the independents, some of the swing voters and that middle tranche of the country ideologically is going to realize how crazy that actually is? I feel like they've been fed a lot of January 6th and Trump, and it's all so awful, but we're going into this period where there's going to be at least, I think, 4, if not 5, prosecutions, whether civil all the way up to federal criminal, of Donald Trump in an election year where he's the top nominee based on polling right now.
Yeah, it's really shocking. And, I think that one of the reasons that this narrative has taken hold, again, it goes back to the media, which for the past 6 years has been normalizing radical behavior. Right? I mean, we constantly get told that it was Donald Trump who broke norms and standards. It's nothing compared to what the Democrats have done on a daily basis since he took office. Now apparently impeachment is something that's just run of the mill. Now it's apparently okay for the Department of Justice to indict the former president of the United States on multiple occasions. Look, I'm really hopeful that there is a middle section of the country who understands the terrible precedents that are being set here. And, part of this is going to come down to, and what I think is the fatal flaw, Jack Smith. I have always argued, if you're going to go down this road and do a first and indict a former president, you better have the most rock solid case ever. You better not be going out on a limb with dubious legal theories and a case where you're still not sure you can get a jury to go. If you can't convince 90% of your country that you had a case that was so serious you need to take this step, that's where I think they could end up losing some people. And, I think that's likely because if you look at what we're hearing, he's going to run these cases on. It doesn't look very solid to me. It looks like a lot of unexplored legal territory that, again, is going to be a first. And I think it could be hard to convince people.
All right, so you have drawn a lot of historical analogies between Jimmy Carter and Joe Biden here. Jimmy Carter led to Ronald Reagan. Is there anybody that you see on the Republican side right now that you think could have Reagan-like qualities? And what I think is so fascinating about Jimmy Carter on the historical analogy is you can say that as Carter was elected because of Watergate and the fallout, I actually think Biden was elected primarily because of COVID, and I think he would have lost if COVID doesn't happen. Leave aside everything else. I think Trump, the economy would have been great. I think Trump would have won comfortably in 20, but for COVID. What is the optimistic thing if you're going to build? Because I do think most people would say coming out of Jimmy Carter, the 80s and 90s were pretty fantastic for most people in America, all the way up to 9/11 when we obviously had that national tragedy. But we had 20 years, an entire generation where a lot of people who are listening to us right now, Buck, myself, you, your husband probably, grew up in the 80s and 90s and kind of thought America was awesome. And we just argued over who thought America was the best in our presidential elections instead of America's the awful, systemically racist, despot country that many Democrats seem to think it is today.
Yeah, boy, I loved those years. And I completely agree with everything you say. This is a big part of the book, pointing out what came after Jimmy Carter. And it wasn't just that Ronald Reagan managed to win that election with a message of hope, by the way, with a policy agenda that was way different than what Republicans had offered before, but was very solid in its own right. He didn't just win that election. He changed electoral politics, as you know, for a generation. And the reason this is so important is I do believe we're at a similar moment now. There is an enormous backlash, just like in the Carter years, to the policies that you've seen coming out of this White House. You've already seen some demographic shifts on the ground. Certain voters, in particular minorities, who are becoming more and more disenchanted with Democratic policies. What the Republican Party needs at the moment, and I sure hope they realize this as they go to do their primary voting, is somebody who I think, A, has a really solid policy agenda more along the lines of Reaganism, because we know it works. Think about those great years you were talking about. But also is optimistic and wants to talk a bit about how great this country is, and also wants to invite into the party those who feel alienated by the Democratic Party. And that means not necessarily in some of these huge cultural issues imposing litmus tests.
The author is our friend Kim Strassel. The book is The Biden Malaise, How America Bounces Back from Joe Biden's Dismal Repeat of the Jimmy Carter Years, even though it is worse than the Jimmy Carter years. Thank you so much, Kim. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a great day.